In this quick video, we're just going to be looking at some of the factors impacting the elasticity of demand. The first one is the type of item. So necessities are always going to have a more inelastic demand. So things like basic foods, bread, cereal, milk, rent, medical supplies are normally going to have an inelastic demand. And the reason for this is we need these products. We can't just, if medicine increases by 5%, that's not going to cause a 30% drop in the quantity demand. We need these products irrespective of their prices, and therefore they have a PED less than 1. Non-necessities, so things like luxury goods, fancy cars, these are likely to have a more elastic demand curve. We don't need them to survive, so if their price was to increase significantly, that's going to cause an even bigger decrease in the quantity demanded. So necessities, inelastic demand, non-necessities or luxury items generally have a more elastic demand curve. Substitutability. If something has a lot of viable substitutes, they're more likely to have a higher elasticity of demand. So for example, if we're at the Queen Victoria Market and we have 7 or 8 different stalls all selling oranges and apples, these products are likely to have a more elastic demand curve purely because if we increase the price, someone's just going to jump into one of the other stalls and buy the products of those instead. So products that are easily substitutable are going to have a more elastic demand curve. Other products that have a higher elasticity of demand, butter and margarine, they're substitutable. Different breakfast cereals are likely to be more responsive to change in price because they're easily substitutable. Demand for these items is generally elastic. If prices rise, we will substitute out of buying these products. If a product is more unique, so an example of that is petrol, and yes, there are substitutes for petrol, so you can fill your car on gas, but there are no direct substitutes. A lot of cars aren't installed with gas, so if petrol prices rise, most people just have to pay the extra cost. And petrol prices is something that's very relevant in 2015, and into 2016. Petrol prices have gone down significantly went down significantly in 2015 because there was an increase in the supply of petrol. And what has actually happened is that because it has an inelastic demand curve, we don't necessarily buy more petrol. Okay, we will buy slightly more, but the main impact is that families have had a lot more money to spend in other areas, purely based on the fact that petrol's gone down by, say, 50 cents a litre. They don't buy a lot more petrol, so they've got a lot more money left in their budget to spend on other goods and services. So if a product is more unique, like petrol, eggs is another example, they're more likely to have an inelastic demand curve. They're not substitutable. The time period, the longer the time period, the more elastic the demand for a product is, or the higher the PED. And the reason for that is, as time goes on, we start to find more viable substitutes. So let's say petrol prices raise to $3 a litre. In the short term, most people are just going to keep buying petrol. But in the long term, more people will buy hybrid cars. More people will get gas installed into their car. So in the long term, more people are going to be put off by the increase in price, and therefore they're less likely to buy the product. Might happen with cereal products. So for example, if rice bubbles went from $2 to $4 a packet, initially people are going, well, I like rice bubbles, I'm going to pay the extra $4. But in the long term, you might go to a good party and eat some cornflakes or some Sultana brand, or find some other form of cereal, and you go, all right, well, now I'm going to eat that. So in the long term, the higher price will put more people off. So the time period can also have an impact on the elasticity of demand. Demand is more inelastic in the short term and more elastic in the long term. And because time gives buyers the opportunity to find alternatives or substitutes. So they have make more rational decisions, and they are able to find alternatives. Again, if petrol prices rise, more people might decide to carpool or find more friends so that they can reduce the costs, their day-to-day costs. More people might find public transport. In the long term, the demand for products is more elastic. And the last two, these two aren't referred to as often, but the cost and relative importance. Expensive things generally have a more elastic demand curve. Cheaper items, the higher prices may not put us off. So for example, if something like salt went from $1 to $1.10, it's not going to have a big impact on most people will buy the salt anyway. But if the price of cars rose by 10%, so cars went from 20,000 to 22,000, that's going to have a bigger impact on the quantity demand. So generally more expensive products have a more elastic demand curve. And lastly, what we call minor complementary items. So if something is used with something bigger, or as a complement to something bigger, generally it will have a more inelastic demand curve. So a good example of that would be, say, salt and steak. If something's like salt is a minor complementary item to your steak, you're not going to just suddenly stop buying salt because its price increases. You need that product to go with your steak, so you will buy it anyway. And another good example of this is ink. Printers and ink. Ink is the minor complementary product there, and therefore businesses can often charge really high prices for ink because they know people are going to buy the ink once they have the printer. So generally minor complementary products have a more inelastic demand curve, and more bigger products, or the larger complementary product, will have a more elastic demand curve. I'm going to get you to do that in class.